thank you again for being here. Week 6. Appreciate your, stick with it, stick to itiveness, to be with me for this. As I pointed out, I'm going to try and pull the Civil War in Maryland together and give a more of a long-term perspective. And talk about the post-war outcomes and the repercussions, here in this state, and to talk a little bit and go a little bit beyond just the state, because Maryland after the war sort of went back to being a southern state again, and while it wasn't in the Confederacy, it kind of acted like that. But we'll get to that. So let's start off. We were right down to the end, and there's Appomattox, April 9th, 1865. Lee surrenders. Maryland troops return home. Some didn't have to go very far. They got home. They just walked it. Some of them were local defense troops serving in the Washington area. They got home with ease. The key thing is that some returned to prosperous areas, like we talked earlier. Some parts of the state were not touched at all by the war. Other parts were fairly well devastated by the war, out in the western part of the state especially. In those places, those Confederates who were returning, and in Baltimore, returning Confederates were met with a jaundiced eye, and there were movements by radical Republicans not to allow them to vote in elections, to save other jobs for union soldiers, etc. So for a little while they were viewed, like I said, with a jaundiced eye. But for the most part, they weren't. Certainly on the eastern shore, where a lot of the political leaders were back in power right away, because they never actually, some of them never left political control in Easton and Eastern Shore counties. Those folks were very much in power during the war. They just couldn't do very much with their power. And so the Confederates were greeted warmly, got their jobs, their work they were doing, farming, et cetera. They could just come right back to it. They didn't have to rebuild. Fortunately for the state, Baltimore didn't have to rebuild. Baltimore was in great shape.
Ready? Very
good.
Thank you. Sorry for
That's all. So during the war and afterward, between 1865 and 1900, as you see here, Baltimore grew from about the 287,000 people in 1860 to 1890 or 1900, when it had 900,000 people there. So what did that really mean for the state? It meant that the state had that many more mouths to feed with food and fuel, coal from the coal mining regions. The railroad had much more work to do. The state was growing overall. And oddly enough, Maryland had grown to 900,000 or so people, but whereas in 1860, it was about tied with Brooklyn, New York as the third largest city in America. By 1900, it was the sixth largest city in America. So other cities were growing even faster. And those were cities like in the Midwest, like Chicago. And because of all of the commerce and the industry that evolved during the Civil War, these Midwestern cities took off and grew, big time because they weren't terribly damaged by the war. The industry grew because of all the supplies that they built, but also agriculture grew substantially. The mechanization of farming, which allowed women and children to run the farms in the absence of their husbands who were in the Union Army, that continued to develop. And as time went on, when the soldiers came back, they just added to this. This is how American farms began to really take over and feed the rest of the world. Because as I think I mentioned, during the war, it was the produce, it was the feed, it was the grain that women and children, basically grew in the Midwest that was shipped to Russia and effectively saved Russians from a huge famine during 1863 and 1864. So the North was truly becoming a mechanized monster, so to speak. For the good, but in a sense, it was growing. The war helped build the North. The South was different because what it was doing, it couldn't ship anything, it couldn't grow cotton, and it didn't have it couldn't ship anything anywhere. It was sort of stuck in after the war. Much of the South was devastated. Fencing, farms broke down, livestock was lost, a lot of livestock was taken by both armies to feed the armies. And so there was, immense poverty, and it took a long time for the South to come out of it. I think it's fair to say that the South continued to be the South. If I make a note here somewhere where in the state of Maryland, many of the people who were political leaders, prior to the war, were right after the war. There's a book, and I forgot the name of it offhand, but it points out that within 10 years after the Civil War, 75% or 70% of the people who were in power in the state houses in the South were back in power. Some had joined the army, some were killed, wounded, whatever, but most of them weren't. And most of them were right back in power. So in a sense, post-war, the South was being forced in the first 10 years or so after the war to recognize black voters, and so there was the resistance in the South to Union occupation, right? And I guess to some degree, you didn't want to be occupied, but if the North was kind of insisting that you provide equal opportunity to former slaves, then it needed occupation. But by 1877, that was the point where the Union forces were withdrawn from the South, and African Americans were left on their own. And by then, the KKK was well underway as an organization and was intimidating black voters and blacks in general. And the beginnings of Jim Crow were started, and black codes, et cetera. And essentially, that's how things developed throughout the South. But in the state of Maryland in 1867, who was back in order, in charge? There was a state convention. And basically, it was the former Democrats, and they were still, I guess, Democrats, who were back in charge. They got reelected. They got elected to the state legislature, the Senate, and the House, the Assembly. And who did they put in charge of this convention? But Judge Carmichael, the same judge who was, from here in Easton, beaten up and arrested for a while. but he was back. And, basically what they did was they undid a lot of the laws that were passed to support African-American civil rights and voting rights. So that was immediately removed here, and they didn't have to wait 10 years to do it. So they did it, and that set things up for giving Marylanders the sense that they had, or at least secessionist Marylanders, the sense that even though they lost slavery, which they were, half slavery was half gone before the war, but this gave them the chance to reassert themselves to control the black population as if they were slaves. Because technically, they weren't truly free. If you're not truly free, you're not free. And so this is the way it eventuated in Maryland. That blacks were largely prevented from owning land, managing businesses. Education, for blacks was, in private schools. And there were numerous private schools, but there was no integration. As a matter of fact, being here for 8 years, I haven't met any handful of African Americans who were part of the school integration in the 60s here. And they'll tell you all the, some of the really miserable details of having gotten spit out and had rocks thrown at them and called every name in the book. And those folks who were doing the name calling are still their neighbors. They're still many of the same people here. So, if anybody tells you that the Civil War wasn't about slavery and control of African Americans, the 100 years after the war, 150 years after the war, pretty much will tell you otherwise. So, be that as it may, this is what was going on in at least on the Eastern Shore and pretty much throughout the state, but probably to a lesser extent where there were more, Union, more of a anti Southern community majority. Okay. Now, in what you often hear is that the winners write the history of the war, whatever wars there were. Back in Greece and Roman times, yeah, I think that was probably the case. But in the case of the American Civil War, that's not accurate. After the American Civil War, former Confederates wrote their own version. And some of you may well have read histories of the Civil War written by Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, General John Gordon, who later became the governor of Georgia and one of the first heads of the United Confederate Veterans Association, John Bell Hood of Texas, James Longstreet, Lee's lieutenant, and Joe Johnston, who survived the war and who had it in for Jefferson Davis, but he wrote his own history. And you didn't have to be a general. Colonel Porter Alexander of Georgia was one of the most prolific writers. He probably wrote as good a history of the war in Virginia as anyone. And even Private Sam Watkins of Tennessee, he wrote that Company H book, which is a classic book. Has anybody read Company H? It's a terrific book. He writes as a private, proudly serving as a private right from the beginning of the war, and he somehow managed to survive the 4 years in the Army of Tennessee, which was a very different animal than serving in the spirited, Army of Northern Virginia with Lee. He fought under these other General Bragg and a bunch of, not nearly as effective leaders as Lee. And he wrote candidly in some ways. But it's many Confederates wrote the history, their own versions of the history. But probably the most influential of the Southern writers were Jubal Early. of Virginia, who was one of Lee's division commanders during the war. And as you remember, he was the general that Lee assigned to go north in 1864 to see if he could attack Washington or to go interfere with the B&O Railroad and everything, and to take some of Grant's men away from the entrenchments of Petersburg and Richmond, which he did, but was probably ineffective in the way he fought the battle and was eventually beaten very badly, soundly, at the Battle of Cedar Creek in the valley later on in 1864, and was so disliked by so many people, especially the civilians there, that Lee had to remove him from command, which he did in 1864. So you also might recall that Early was the gentleman who seemed to convince General Buell not to try to take the Gettysburg Hill on the first evening of the Battle of Gettysburg. He didn't want to lose any more men and seemed to convince him not to do that. And because Lee seemed to give him the option, because if it was practicable, that was the key word. So Early was an interesting character. You know, interestingly, after the war, after Appomattox, Early left the country for fear of reprisal. And didn't come back to the United States for 2 to 3 years after the war. But he moved back to Virginia. He lived in right near, and he's buried in near Washington and Lee College at the cemetery in Lexington. And along with his cohorts, Nelson Pendleton and William Jones, J. William Jones. They were the guys who started the Southern Historical Society, which meant that they were going to write the Southern version. And in the many years following, they were the editors of the Southern Historical Society papers. And I was reminded just the other day, and I put it in this outline, that they wrote 52 volumes of the Southern version of the war. And that very much, in essence, is what the version that we learned in school. And interestingly, they didn't write them they didn't put them into books right away. What they did was on a month-to-month basis, they had these articles published, but published by Northern magazines. The Century Illustrated, I think Scribner's had a monthly magazine. Atlantic had a monthly magazine way back then. And it was the Northern publishers who gave these Southerners all of the ink they needed, all the column inches they needed to convince and repeat their story time after time. And it was the story of Southern courage. It was the story of always fighting at a disadvantage. It was the story of General Lee, the invincible General Lee. And that was part of this image that most everybody in the South had. And that's why for decades and decades, virtually every house in the South had a portrait of General Lee over the fireplace. He was raised to this, saintly, level throughout the South and in the North as well. I mean, I think an awful lot of people in the North looked upon him as the major, factor in the war, an invincible chieftain of the Army of Northern Virginia. I did when I was a kid. I read all about General Lee. That's one of the things that I took away from as being a kid and reading all about these heroes, these Southern heroes, Lee and Jackson. That was what originally gave me my interest in the Civil War. and I read more and more about it, and over a lifetime, well, I take that, I've learned a lot, yes.
Is that the reason why so many military posts have Southern form?
Yes, yeah.
It's amazing.
What's really crazy is, and I did 2 summer camps at Fort Bragg, North
Okay.
Carolina. Now, why anybody why any Southerner would want any fort named after, Braxton Bragg is unusual, because he was probably one of the people who, undermined the Confederate effort in the Western Theater. He was just a complete misfit as a leader, but he was a friend of Jefferson Davis. And he wasn't going to get fired or hurt or canned or anything. I mean, he was just kept in place. And after Davis finally got him out of command, he brought him to Richmond to be his #1 advisor. So, I mean, that's what, if you're a friend of Jeff Davis, you fairly well had it made. Or if you get in Jeff Davis's ear, the way John Bell Hood did when he was wounded, the story goes, and I think it's probably a lot of accuracy to it, that when it came to Sherman's Atlanta campaign, before he got to Atlanta, Joe Johnston was the general in charge of the Army of the West, and so Army of Tennessee essentially, and he was a guy who would make the enemy pay for every yard that they got, including the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, which was disastrous for Sherman. But Sherman was smart enough to keep dodging and flanking Joe Johnston. So the closer they got to Atlanta, once the army of all Sherman's armies crossed the Chattahoochee, the people in Richmond were getting very nervous about losing Atlanta. And John Hood kept after, Davis to remove him, because he felt like he should be attacking. That was Hood's whole thing, just attack. And so finally he convinced him, and as the Yankees were in the siege of Atlanta, Davis replaced Joe Johnston, who he despised, and they despised each other, with John Bell Hood. And a couple of days later, the Battle of Peachtree Creek occurred, and that was the first step in the Confederates not being able to hold Atlanta much at all. And they held it for another month, but finally they didn't have the power to stop Sherman from closing off the supply, the railroad supply routes. But again, but Hood had he did his history. They all did their history, and Early with the 52 lines probably did as much as any person to foster and develop the lost cause mythology, which I think most of us have grown up learning. So to that extent, that all had its impact on Maryland. And this is one of the reasons why Maryland took its place in the pantheon of Confederate mythology, to the point where people today still have great reverence. We have in the state until very recently, the Sons of Confederate Veterans organization, was very active. I remember when my daughter started going to St. Mary's College down in St. Mary's County, we would go down for Memorial Day, and every time we would go down there, we would pass by somehow this one Confederate square. It was like a square, and there would always be a Confederate memorial service going on with guys dressed up as Confederates and doing reverential things, with the Confederate flags out and everything. And that's part of the ritual that was initiated originally, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, by the the Confederate veterans themselves, they had an association. They would meet every year in some city. There would be thousands of people commemorating the heroic efforts that they put forth. And so essentially they honored their efforts. Now, there are a couple of definitions of the lost cause. I want to say, I didn't do this, but here's what I'm going to do. I have a list of books on the lost cause, which I'm going to send to you. I'm going to thank you all for being here in writing, and you guys on Zoom as well. But I have a list of books on the lost cause. I have donated a couple of those books myself to the library, and they're on the shelves. One is called The Lost Cause. It's cell 1865 to 1900 by Rao and Oscar Weiss. There's another one that's in the St. Michael's branch, same name, by Edward Bonekemper. And there are numerous others that you can get. I'm sure that the bookstores, would have some, especially the one on Route 50 down in Track. But these are important books because they explain all this in great detail. A couple of my favorite descriptions were, one is by William Garrett Piston, who wrote of James Longstreet. He wrote Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant. And he himself, I met him, I had a lunch with him one day when I was at the round table of Washington, D.C. Really great guy. He himself was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, Missouri chapter, one of the Missouri chapters. He wrote this book, and he wrote, to explain how a righteous cause, blessed of God, could fail, former Confederates devoted themselves to the memory of their acts. They cultivated what historians usually call the lost cause myth. This myth and its mentality, which produced it, profoundly affected General Longstreet's place in Southern history. That's because a big part of what the lost cause and Jubal Early and his group had to do was to establish Robert E. Lee's invincibility. And of course, Gettysburg was the big 500-pound gorilla in the room, so they had to essentially explain Gettysburg. And so what they did was they blamed it on Longstreet. They claimed that Longstreet received an order on the second day of Gettysburg to attack in the morning. And no such order was ever produced. But Early managed to get a couple of Lee's orderlies from his headquarters to acknowledge that there was a dawn attack order, which years later they denied. But this developed this theory that absolved everybody else, of course, everybody except Longstreet and also secondarily Jeb Stuart, because the cavalry got lost and they were no real help in the Battle of Gettysburg. So Stuart, to one degree or other, as a Virginian, also got some blame for that battle. But he was never replaced by Lee because Lee just didn't have anybody who he considered better than Jeb Stuart. And also, Longstreet remained Lee's key lieutenant throughout the war. But that gets swept under the rug because of what happened at Gettysburg, because that's the one big explanation that had to happen. And so there have been many books about that, and one of the books is Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant, written by William Garrett Piston. But also, there was another book on the myth of the lost cause by Gary Gallagher and Alan Nolan, and they wrote again of the identification of the lost cause and identified it. In a sense, they're saying there occurred a brief period during which the United States attempted to reform Southern political life by drawing into the freed slaves and protecting them from persecution and discrimination. The Southern people persistently opposed these efforts, often pursuing cruel and violent acts against the freed people, white Northerners the United States soldiers were withdrawn from the South. The Confederate leadership returned to power in the former Confederate states and succeeded in institutionalizing the discriminatory and violent treatment of the free people, excluding them from political life. And of course, the name of the book is The Myth of the Lost Cause. So there are numerous articles in this book, which was edited by these two men, regarding the lost cause, defining it and explaining how it occurred. It's important to come away with an understanding of how this mythology developed, because it impacts all of us who have any interest whatsoever in the Civil War, and it still does today. It has impacted this community with the Talbot boys. There are folks who, I've often discussed in the newspaper, I don't know if you've read my stuff, but I've argued that we should move it because I felt like it misrepresented the history of the county. The history we see is that 400 or so white Union men fought on the Union side, 500 or so African Americans fought for the Union side, and 82 men fought for the Confederate side. How could there be a statue just to commemorate Confederates? How is that historical? Are we erasing history? No, that wasn't history in the first place. Now, let me explain what I think had everything to do with that statue being put there. You see this photo in your handout. That is the photo commemorating the 1st Regiment Eastern Shore Volunteer Infantry that fought at Gettysburg at Culp's Hill. This photo was taken, I guess it was taken, I don't know when it was taken, but this statue was placed there and unveiled at the 50th anniversary reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg. And there were many, not just this one, but there were many there. It was a huge reunion. And it was attended by Marylanders of both sides, by Unionist Marylanders and Confederate Marylanders. But for Marylanders, the Confederate Marylanders, there was one thing that really stood out most about this statue. It's at the bottom. The Maryland's tribute to her loyal sons. And I think it's fair to say that hired a number of people whose sons didn't fight for Maryland, but they felt that they were being loyal, I suppose, to the state while trying to get it to secede and overcome the Union. It's been discussed in debates, here in our local newspapers over the last 6 years or so. But I think that has a lot to do with why that statue was built under the circumstances, because that was in 1913 when that statue went up, and it was in 1916 that the Talbot boys was actually erected, placed, and put there. So the time frame is pretty clear that happened in response to this Gettysburg statue. All right. We go on and talk about some more lost cause. We talked about Century Magazine and books that were written about the lost cause. The lost cause got its name the year after the end of the Civil War, when the editor of the Richmond Examiner, Edwin Pollard, wrote his book called The Lost Cause. And from there on, that name never disappeared. Literature had everything to do with the images that were drawn of the antebellum South. Part of the lost cause is, what was lost in the lost cause? Well, what was lost to these folks was the antebellum civilization. And to them, it was the ultimate Christian civil, achievement of civilization in the history of mankind, because they had a wonderful land and this idyllic place that you see, and you conjure up the thoughts of Gone with the Wind, and all of this literature written by these famous people back in the day, Thomas Nelson Page, Joel Chandler Harris, and many others. Songs by
Stephen Foster.
Stephen Foster. Yes, thank you. My Old Kentucky Home and Oh Susanna and all these wonderful things. And they all survive to this day. Every year you listen to My Old Kentucky Home at the Kentucky Derby, speaking of horse racing. And for forever we've listened to Maryland, My Maryland at the Preakness. This is all Civil War stuff. This is lost cause mythology living these today. And do we ever think much about it? Nah. But when you listen to the words of Maryland, My Maryland, it comes right in your face. So now Maryland, My Maryland is no longer the official song of the state of Maryland. But the interesting thing to me was how the lost cause mythology continued to grow well into the 20th century. I was rather shocked to see that Maryland, My Maryland became the state song of Maryland in 1940. Of course, the year after Gone with the Wind had its, big impact. That was pretty shocking to me. What's the other? Oh yeah, the Robert E. Lee Park in Baltimore County. Robert E. Lee Park became Robert E. Lee Park in 1939. And to me, that's as big an irony as you can ever find, because during the Civil War, Marylanders absolutely feared that Robert E. Lee was going to attack Maryland, which he, when he went to Gettysburg, Maryland, Feltman, and there's writings from Lee that breaking up Maryland, breaking up Baltimore was one of the goals of the Army of Northern Virginia on the campaign, as well as taking Washington. He understood the impact of Baltimore on the Union war effort, and he sought everything he could do to bring it down. The same with Stonewall Jackson. And of course, Robert E. Lee Park was named Robert E. Lee Park, and the statue of Lee and Jackson were put there, and it's as if nobody remembers anything about what actually happened in the Civil War. And that's because of the mythology that occurred afterward and has been, continually repeated and repeated. It's repeated from month to month to month by the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They are the ones who created Southern Memorial Day, where they decorate the Southern cemeteries, soldiers' cemeteries. The rituals of having Confederate veterans speak at these events while they were still alive into the 1900s. I mean, Jeff Davis lived into the 20th century, and he spoke at many of these things, and he never looked back. He always maintained his shtick that we were just fighting for our independence from the overbearing Union. And so a lot of people felt that way then, and their descendants, and like I think I mentioned, a lot of Southerners that I knew when I lived in Georgia, they learned, I think I said this, they learned their history from their grandparents on their grandpappy's knee. And so they ain't forgetting that. forget Hill is what they used to be bumper sticker. Forget Hill. Yes.
I was going to say, I've been reading a lot about the Revolutionary War, and it surprised me that they referred to that war as the cause. If you think about it. So there's an imagery here of, okay, we've got another cause, an overbearing king or dictator who's trying to rule over us. We need to throw it off, right?
Right.
It's
George
almost the
Washington.
same story.
George Washington was a major, icon of, in the Confederacy, because he was a great revolutionary, along with Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, et cetera. So they had their concepts. They were educated people. They were smart, but they were in complete, planter class especially, was in complete control of the South. And what's really interesting is that Jefferson Davis, one of the things that he had to watch his P's and Q's with was how he dealt with Robert E. Lee. He deferred to Lee much of the time because he wasn't a planter. He was. I mean, he became one. Why? How did he become? Do anybody know how Jefferson Davis became a landowner on the Mississippi? His brother gave him the land. His brother, I forgot his first name, but his brother was very, very wealthy. Jeff Davis was born similarly to Abraham Lincoln in Kentucky, a poor Kentucky farmer. His parents were both, poor people. But Davis somehow got an opportunity to go to Transylvania University in Kentucky and was educated there. Then later he went to West Point. Lincoln never did get a formal education, learned law, by just reading on his own. But the fact is that Jeff Davis became wealthy when his brother gave him massive plantation on the Mississippi, or just off the Mississippi River. And so while he had the plant, he wasn't born into it like Lee. And so he deferred to Lee, and Lee understood this relationship, and he kind of lorded over Davis much of the time. Although, if you look at his writings in the wartime papers of Robert E. Lee, he refers to Jefferson Davis as Your Excellency. Lee played the game pretty darn well. He was no fool either. He was a brilliant guy. So, but that's sort of what happens when it comes to how we remember the Civil War and why we remember it this way. Now, if you guys hang with me, what I have done, last term at Washington College, I taught a 6-part course in the lost cause. And I would like to do the same thing here for the next term, if it's all right with you guys. So when you see it happen, I mean, just say you'd like to see it, because that is really a great course. We go into all this in great detail. And if you have a chance to read some of these books, which are already in our library, or get your hands on some of those books, it'll really be that much more meaningful
I would like to see
next
that.
time around. So just leave that in the background for now. Plays. Shenandoah, you might have seen the movie Shenandoah. That was a great play that started off in New York. The Heart of Maryland was another one of these. Maryland tried to do it. We tried to be with our Southern brothers, but we couldn't because of the damn Yankees and that Lincoln's character. Those were important plays that became movies. I mean, later on became. I don't know that Heart of Maryland ever became a movie, but Shenandoah. I mean, I saw Jimmy Stewart was thinking that one. That was a great movie. But the huge movies were The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. The Birth of a Nation was around 1915, right around the time where the former Confederate states were celebrating the overall success of Jim Crow. That was the height of Jim Crow, and it was theirs. And at that point, nobody could take it away, and nobody did take it away from them for another half a century. And so the Birth of a Nation was, you've seen it, I'm sure. you know, how the Ku Klux Klan saved white women from the abortion, African American people in the South, and that glorified them. And it, you know, considering that President Woodrow Wilson showed that movie in the White House when it was premiered, was you know, it was a major acceptance by the whole country of that as an explanation of what the Ku Klux Klan was about.
Wilson was a Southerner. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner.
His father served in the Army of Northern Virginia, along with the father of that author, the lead author. I mentioned. I should know his name offhand. It's always on the tip of my tongue. Douglas Southall Freeman. Douglas Southall Freeman wrote Lee's Lieutenants, and he wrote Robert E. Lee, the biography of Lee. It was sort of like, it's almost like reading Psalms out of the Bible. I mean, he just, you know, worshiped Lee, and basically he did as much to promote Lee and took the ball from Jubal Early and those guys, and he took it to the next level with Lee, to where when we were kids, Lee was like, time to worship, to bless yourself when you see it, say his name.
So,
Yes.
what was the genesis of Robert E. Lee Park that is now available for us?
What?
What is the genesis of that park coming into?
Well, it was, I forgot the name of the park itself, but it was a park. They just renamed it and they put the statue there. As a matter of fact, before he died, I met Kevin Kamenetz, who was the Baltimore County executive, who removed the statue and changed the name about, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago. But it was that for all that time. Yeah, I mean, to think that this was happening in Baltimore, you know, the city that quietly supported the Union, you know, to the hilt, in a state that quietly supported the Union to the hilt, you know, is pretty shocking. But it just shows the effect of how whoever writes the history is winning the war. You know, we said earlier that the North won the war, but the South won the peace. That is how the South won the peace, by the lost cause mythology, and how they ardently wrote to glorify the cause that they served, and denied that slavery was the cause of the war, had much of anything to do with the cause of why the South seceded. They were just trying to be independent. Well, I think that, you know, if you believe that, it's because you just want to believe that, not because of any evidence, you know, that is extant, you know, in the record.
So what you're saying is that they renamed it Robert Lee Park because people were sympathetic to.
Right. Oh, yeah. And from what I understand, there was a family, a very wealthy family, that owned some of that property, and they would give it to the county if they would do a Robert E. Lee Park, change the name to Robert E. Lee Park, and they were friends of Lee. The family had been friends of Lee during the war or before the war or some such thing like that. And so they used their influence as wealthy, and they were probably secessionists, you know, prior to the war. And that's how people of wealth and influence impact a community and write their own history. Yes? So, okay. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're okay. All right, and so what are some of the reflections of lost cause mythology and this rewriting of history in the state of Maryland? One of the first thing was, you know, I think was the Roger Taney statue placed on the grounds of the state capitol of Annapolis. Roger Taney, certainly we remember from the business of habeas corpus with Lincoln. But what was really, why they really loved Taney was because of the Dred Scott decision, saying that no black man has any right that a white man needs to honor, and taking away any hope, in essence, of citizenship for black people, and just basically permanently making them, assigning them that secondary slavery status as chattel, like cattle or land or et cetera. So that was really the special status. And amazingly enough, it was when our governor, previous governor, took just on his first week in office, just without any further discussion, just removed the statute. I'm not sure what they did with it. I don't think that they destroyed it or anything. They probably got it someplace, elsewhere, but certainly not on the grounds of the state capitol. Maryland was another relic of the lost cause. We know that the words, the O Tannenbaum was the melody, and the words, were written by James Ryder Randall in New Orleans after the commemorating, the people, the Marylanders who were killed, attacking the Union troops as they came through. Randall himself believed, heard that his good friend was killed, was one of the 4 Marylanders killed in that confrontation. But it turned out he wasn't. But that song just carried the day, and it remained an anthem, and it's still basically a lost cause anthem in this country. Robert E. Lee Park, and then the Sons of Confederate Veterans and Daughters of the Confederacy had numerous chapters in the state of Maryland, and many, throughout the South, and wherever they moved to, wherever there were daughters and SCV, groups throughout the country for many years. It has lost a lot of its push, a lot of its esteem, in many areas because of what has happened with the Confederate flag and all the controversy, especially after the Charleston massacre. And this is one of the things that I think impacted me, regarding the Talbot Boy statue. I mean, I remember, I have been to the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, and for years that had the Confederate flag standing on the, in an honored place right next to the Capitol, State Capitol building. That flag was going to be there for eternity, and also on top of the dome there was a Confederate flag. That massacre in Charleston down the road from, took the governor of South Carolina, Senator Brand, and most key South Carolinian leaders and individuals to acknowledge that the flag has no, shouldn't be there anymore on the state. It doesn't represent what the state represents. They saw that. If they could see that in South Carolina, how could we not see that in Eastern Maryland? Same with Mississippi. Mississippi took the state, when I was a kid, you watch a Mississippi football game, there were 40,000 little Confederate flags that were flying to cheer on the rebels of the University of Mississippi. They're still the rebels, but there ain't no Confederate flags anymore because they've been removed, because young people and leaders in Mississippi now acknowledge that that flag has no business there. The state of Georgia had, a little flag and a little Confederate flag in the corner of its state flag for years. That was removed. And and many places took down those Confederate flags. And I just felt that it was unusual that people in Eastern Maryland could see themselves as being in such a vacuum that all those other acknowledgments that the Confederate flag doesn't belong in places, in public places of, especially like a courthouse, that doesn't matter to us here. Oh, I think it does and it should, and that's one of the biggest reasons why I myself supported moving it and joined the monument organization. So, I mean, take little steps at a time, and I think it's important, that we continue to do that. But that's why, and the reason why there's so much attentiveness and glorification, adoration of the Confederate enterprise was this mythology. And it even though Maryland didn't really participate, and although Marylanders were shunned, even in Confederate hospitals in Richmond, they still went for this lost cause. And it is largely is still alive. And it's only going to be educating folks like us and to speak out and to know the facts that things will ever really change. And although fully they're changing now, but we still, I think, have a long way to go. And I think that there's a move. When you hear a congressperson or a senator talking about secession, that's where this comes from. They don't, they didn't fight in the war, but that's how they get those supporters revved up, and that's what they're doing. They're getting the base revved up so that that they can start talking about that again and keep it alive. And it's the mythology that they're keeping alive, not the history. The history we've seen the history, we've covered that, but we're talking about why we're living today in this society that so glorifies or shows such great almost religious remembrance of the Confederacy. The South is called the Bible Belt. It's the Bible Belt because the Bible told these people, in the comment from William Garrett Piston, to explain how a righteous cause, blessed by God, could fail. That's important. That's no small little phrase. They felt, and we talked about that briefly, how the churches, the Christian churches, the Catholic churches, prior to the war, broke up, North and South, because the southern synods of the Protestant sects and the Catholic Church down there acknowledged that in the Bible that slavery was in the Bible and it was okay for slavery. It was those southern preachers, prelates, they made it okay for those religious people in the South to fight for secession and slavery because of the Bible, because of God. And that's a strong argument. That's what they felt. After the war that they lost, they sacrificed, they died, they were wounded, their property was largely demolished. They had to explain that away. And that's what they've been doing. And this explains it away. They're denying, that's why they denied that they weren't really fighting for slavery. They were fighting for their independence. They deny slavery as part of what the lost cause mythology is. And that's what those folks that, guys in Georgia, who I, visit with and read and communicate with on sports websites down there, that's what a lot of them really think. And when they hear it from grandpa and grandma and mom and dad, they still believe it no matter what you say. And so we should know better. I hope we do know better. And my hope is to be able to go into this in great detail so that, under the aegis of the Chesapeake Forum next term or two. So Okay, so what are the results? Well, number one, generally sympathetic, even heroic images of the Confederate enterprise and its soldiers, leaders fighting for a worthy cause. That summarizes what the law was. That summarizes what Marylanders, many Marylanders, see as the Civil War, the history of the Civil War. It's also important for people who support that idea to maintain a shallow grasp of the studied cruelty and the immense greed, the emotional, sexual, physical, and psychological horrors of slavery. Unless we read about what slavery really did to people, we talk about slavery, I mean, as kids, slavery, sure, slavery, kept slaves. But what never is really gotten into is the depth of the inhumanity of slavery. If you really got into that inhumanity, we would be far less forgiving and far more understanding of the depravity and rather than seeing the antebellum South as the Gone with the Wind South, we would have had a much more reasonable, realistic view of what that gulag of 4 million slaves, how they lived and how they suffered, so that some 4, 5, 10% of those people could live like they lived in Gone with the Wind. That's crucially important. The false image of the antebellum South as the idyllic civilization cleansed of the massive gulag. That's, crucial. You have the handout?
And that's not.
I can know. Great, thank you.
Ongoing glorification of the Confederate soldiers and the cause, along with suggestions of the need to have states secede because of differences among Americans. We have our differences. And so some of us feel like, okay, well, it would have worked the first time if we had succeeded. Now we'll do it again. And this time we will succeed because we're different than you people in that part or that part or that part of the country. That's there. You see it. You read about it. It's been in the papers, in the last several weeks. It's still there. It comes from this image of secession is not such a bad thing. And of course, to embrace the concepts of racism, white supremacy as legitimate, politically and legally in America today. Slavery was legitimate in 1860. It was legal. It was blessed of God. It was legitimate politically. The people, those who made the laws, felt strongly that this was working in the South. So, if you believe in the lost cause, that's what you still think could come back, along with the CRT effort to dismiss any challenge to critical considerations of Confederates or the Confederacy in public education. We mustn't teach our children that their Confederate ancestors were in any way less than heroic leaders. This is what CRT works very hard to prevent. I think that when you look at the overall impact of lost cause and what we have learned and what is taught and is still fighting to be taught, that's what you have. That's why these things are happening. That's why we see the Civil War as the way we do, and why that's mistaken. Comments, questions? Yes.
It's probably obvious in here, but what does CRT stand for?
Central.
What does CRT mean?
Critical race.
Critical race theory, I didn't.
CRT.
I
Yeah.
did that.
Critical race theory. Yeah. Yes.
So after all is said and done, and maybe it never will be, what is the nonpartisan view of Robert E. Lee?
I have a realistic view of Robert E. Lee. I think he was as good a tactician as any general that in American history. He understood tactics, especially in Virginia, where he and his subordinates knew the territory. They were very difficult to defeat because they knew the territory there. Well, as soon as they got to Maryland and Pennsylvania, they didn't know the territory anymore. And Lee put himself strategically, he couldn't take advantage of his tactical skills because he didn't know the territory in Pennsylvania. So strategically, he put himself and his army at numerous huge disadvantages by going up there and not just staying in Virginia and fighting the war out there on a defensive basis where he wouldn't lose so many men, although he was losing men. But the fact is that as a tactician, he was great. I think as a personal leader with his own aura, especially as a Southerner, he had the aura of the upper echelon of a great Virginian. He had that Washingtonian aura, where his father was a cohort of George Washington, and to that extent, he had charisma. He had great charisma. He could turn those men in that army of Northern Virginia, he could make them go run through a wall if he told them to. So to that extent, he was a great general. On the other hand, he had limitations, and his concept, he grew up during, before the rifling of the musket. He grew up back in the day of the smoothbore with short range. And so as he had a lot of company with those older generals during the war who didn't have the concept of not charging in mass into large formations of men. He wasn't alone in that, but he didn't ever get really past that. And the ultimate, even lost cause historians like Shelby Foote. You remember Shelby Foote from the Burns, the Ken Burns series? How does Shelby Foote explain Gettysburg? Remember? He wrote a book about it. The book was The Stars and Their Courses. It was the start. I mean, right? That woke me up. The Stars and Their Courses basically explains that it was the stars that caused all this to transpire against Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg. It wasn't that he made the mistakes. The stars, it was just fate. It's the fact that the fate caused Judge Stewart to go get lost with his cavalry. It didn't seem to suggest that Lee allowed him, he didn't give him strict enough orders to stay attuned and stay in touch with Ewell's corps as they went further north, as far as the Susquehanna River at Wrightsville. He didn't order him to do it. He knew Judge Stewart. He knew that he was a jaunty and an enterprising guy who loved his women and the newspaper headlines. He knew that, so he didn't give him enough strict orders. And a lot of people will say, and Ewell said that afterward. I mean, when you got an order from Stonewall Jackson, you knew what you were going to do, and you knew what you were not going to do. Lee was different. Lee gave
leeway when he gave an order. Interestingly, and this goes back to how he reorganized his army before the Gettysburg campaign. Remember, I mentioned before Gettysburg, even up to Chancellorsville, where Stonewall Jackson was killed. He had two corps, one Jackson's corps, Longstreet's corps. He communicated with two people. He could give leeway to those two people because he knew them and he knew how good they were. But when you had two new corps commanders and you gave them leeway, that was a mistake. He needed to be more, firm. He needed that Cemetery Hill to be captured and attacked that day. But he said, if practical. Those two words came back to haunt him. Right? So, as great as he was as a leader, as a man of dignity and everything, he, and great as he was a tactician, he wasn't great strategically. That strategic move in the first invasion of the North over ending in the Battle of Antietam, that largely, not completely, but largely lost European recognition for the Confederacy in that one swoop. It became pretty clear to the Europeans that Lee was driven out of Maryland back into Virginia. That really seriously hurt their opportunity for recognition by England and France, and it gave Lincoln his opening to emancipate slaves in the South. And so that strategically was a killer for the South.
Well, as a follow-up, what I find as a huge stumbling block in accepting Robert E. Lee as having been a good person is that he didn't, while he might have been strategically a genius and successful or not, that he didn't first and foremost understand that human bondage is not the answer to an economic.
Right. And let me say this, and I didn't mention this, but I will now. Lee, if you read the law, and people who talk about him, who have that bent of mind, who have his, portrait of their fireplace, they'll all tell you Lee hated slavery. Why? Because it was bad for white people? Yeah, that's why he hated slavery. But he didn't hate slavery. He didn't hate slavery at all. In fact, after his father-in-law passed away, he was in charge of Custis, the Custis slaves at Arlington, and all the slaves that his father-in-law owned. Well, the slaves expected to be freed because they all knew, they were told by George Washington Parke Custis that after he passed away that they would all be free. Lee kept them until all the bills, of the plantation of Arlington House and the other two major properties were repaired, sold off, or prepared for the sons. Because each of Lee's three sons got one of those plantations. The eldest of the three, Custis Lee, he was given Arlington. And so Lee maintained those slaves. He also rented them out. And when one tried to escape, he had a guy come and give the guy a whipping. He didn't do it himself, apparently, but he oversaw it. So he felt like that those people were not worthy of being citizens, or that they were human. I just don't see that. He also wrote in a letter to his wife during the war, when she was, soft on this, and he wrote that, look, slavery isn't, it's not a great thing, it has its faults, but on the other hand, it's not up to us to change it. It's not up to us to abolish slavery. That's something for the work of providence, of God, essentially. It's up to God. When God wants to abolish slavery, God will do it. And it'll be foreordained by providence, so to speak. And so that told, and the other thing was that after the war, he wrote to his sons and advised them strongly not to ever hire African American blacks because they're lazy and et cetera, et cetera. You know, they won't work, they won't do the right thing as employees. So Robert E. Lee didn't hate slavery, other than, you know, he may have understood that it may, you know, maybe he was talking about the 25% of white men who didn't own slaves or land. Maybe slavery made them lazy. Could have. But the point is that he didn't really care much about abolition of slavery, or even what I always feel would have been a great compromise prior to the war, would be that if planters in the South had simply listened to many of the religious leaders of the South, they suggested prior to the war some compromises on slavery, to soften it to some degree, to honor slave marriages, to allow to give some compensation, some minor whatever compensation to blacks, but to give them some incentive to soften slavery. But that was dismissed by the planter class. And so, and that was Lee. And the other thing that bothers me about Lee was that he never recognized, that I could see in writing, in any of his writings, that in 1833, the Virginia legislature, he was, in 1833, he was 25, something like that. That the Virginia legislature came within a couple of votes of abolishing slavery. So how could he go from that to leaving it to a divine providence who's you know, who for whom one day is a millennium? You know, that's not intellectual honesty from my standpoint. And so I think that the point that you make about his vision of humanity is absolutely right. He did not care anything much about the soul of slaves and didn't protest the abuse of slaves. In fact, he participated to some extent in the abuse of slaves. I think that's fair in the overall, I think a fair explanation of Lee has to include those items that I mentioned. Yes.
Kind of following on with this same thought. Number 4, the results of lost cause mythology you have here
Yes.
was the ignorance of distortion of the Bible and Christianity to sanctify the institution of slavery.
Right.
How do you justify that statement with the fact that slavery is in the Bible and Jesus said, slaves obey your masters? I'm just trying to get your thinking on it.
Well, the sons of Ham, I'm not professorial when it comes to the Bible, although I'm an older boy. I was not a Boy Scout.
Yeah.
I was older. The Bible indicates that the sons of Ham, who were from that family were dark-skinned people, were always to be the servants of white people. That was interpreted by the clergy in the South, to mean that slavery was approved and okay in the Bible. I don't think it says anywhere where Jesus, in the New Testament, where slavery was okay. If anything, Jesus would have, everything about Jesus Christ is, love thy neighbor as thyself. He doesn't talk about black people or anything like that. And so it's all Old Testament stuff. And so,
Actually, it's not.
well,
I mean, Jesus said those words, slaves, obey your masters. I'm not trying to justify slavery, I'm just saying, I can see how someone in the South would say this is providentially blessed by God. He didn't say black slaves, just slaves.
well, yeah, and that's the other side of the coin. I mean, a lot of people, just felt like it was black. I mean, what the Southern Constitution said was that blacks are slaves because they're black. And forever. So there was that foreverness that the Southern Constitution had. But yeah, I can't argue with that, with the statement. But largely, it goes back, I mean, from what I've read from friends, Southerners, talk about the sons of Ham. That's the original thing. I think when you I can't address. I will though. I'll tell you what. For the next class, I will address that, and I'll go in down into the weeds with that, and give you a fair version, hopefully, of that discussion.
That quote was not from Jesus, it was from Paul.
Oh, it was.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'll get into the weeds and I'll find that, and thank you, you've led me in the right direction.
Well, that's an area I have no knowledge of. But what I wanted to bring, what I read recently, which sort of distorted my original view. Jackson had this, first of all, he was a military science professor at the MI. All of his battles he won so decisively, and that he was such a brilliant general. They said, but he was killed before the Northern generals got their experience, and he was beating very armies that weren't well trained, that weren't well, and maybe he would have adapted if he fought against the generals that really understood military science.
General Patterson and some of the men, his Union counterparts in the Valley campaign were not strong generals. And the generals that Lee opposed were not strong generals. I mean, for what he did at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, Ambrose Burnside was summarily drop kicked out of out of command of the Army of the Potomac. And for what Lee said of the Union effort is that it is good that war is so cruel because we could come to like it, because they were behind the wall on Mary's Heights. In Fredericksburg, they were just mowing down the Union troops running up the hill to try to overwhelm the wall, and they never did. But 7 months later, Lee did the same thing, essentially at Gettysburg.
That's Napoleonic.
Yeah, that's right. And look what it did for him. And the Union soldiers, some of them were yelling Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, because they saw the connection. Lee did, unfortunately for the Confederacy.
Was Jackson a religious fanatic?
He was apparently a deeply religious man.
So fanatic, I think, but
He said, I don't know otherwise. I've read, just as Douglas Southall Freeman wrote about Lee, that Virginia Tech professor wrote about Jackson, and he did it within the last, he's deceased now, but it was about maybe 20, 25 years, that his big volume on Jackson, very celebrated. He just depicted every possible, wonderfulness about Stonewall. And, unquestionably, Stonewall was a skilled leader. He knew the valley. He knew the territory. Again, that helped him just as it helped Lee in Virginia. but he was probably a little overly aggressive. He wanted to, his concept, and partially Lee's as well, was to obliterate his opponent, to just, take the army apart and win a battle of annihilation. That's what he was, I guess, well known for among the Confederate side. And was a little scary for Lee. That's what, Lee, when he promoted Longstreet and Jackson the same day to lieutenant general, he promoted Longstreet senior 20 minutes before he promoted Jackson. That's because he felt like Longstreet, we can rely more on Longstreet. His judgment was more conservative than Jackson. I don't know that, but I understand enough about when you're promoting officers. When the one you promote first is senior to the one you promote second, third, fourth, and fifth. So I think that was in the back of Lee's mind. But Jackson was brilliant. He was offensive in terms of, and passion for the cause. He wanted to kill Yankees. He wanted to annihilate that and kill Yankees. I rarely saw that sort of commentary from officers on either side. But that was the heart, the soul of Jackson, his aggressiveness. And that's what led to his demise, essentially. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, a major Confederate victory, where Jackson's corps, he sent his corps around and attacked the Union 11th Corps in the flank when they were just not expecting any attack at all. They felt they were safe. That was the start of the victory at Chancellorsville. But at the end of the day, when dusk was approaching, he took a small party to find out where the Union line was. Now, he could have sent somebody, but he felt like he had to do it himself because he wanted to continue that same attack the same day, no matter what. As he felt like he needed to see it, he didn't want to listen to what anybody else's opinion was. He felt like he wanted to see it. And then on his way back, it was too dark for these North Carolina guard duty people to see who it was, so they just fired him. They wounded him, hit him several times. He lost his arm, and he died a few days later of pneumonia. But again, what also surprises me a little bit is that within a week after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and within days of the actual death of Jackson, Lee was in Richmond planning, or at least trying to convince Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet to undertake the invasion of Pennsylvania. So here he was losing, he said, tell General Jackson that he may have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm. And he probably meant it, and I'm sure, but it didn't deter Lee from going on, his greatest of all, campaigns, or worst of all campaigns. Depending on how you see it. But it was a decisive campaign that he was intending to handle, to initiate into Pennsylvania. It turned out to be fairly decisive, along with the loss of Vicksburg that same weekend. That spelled it's what it really spelled was the loss of offensive capability of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's what it did. And it gave the Union Army of the Potomac all kinds of confidence that it could defeat Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, which they had not done to that point. And they had done it with a general who was in charge for 4 days prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. And that was another misjudgment by Lee, because Lee assumed that he was against Joe Hooker, And all of a sudden, he was against a much more conservative, thoughtful guy who had been a corps commander in the Army of the Potomac from virtually the outset. And that man fought a much smarter defensive campaign that Lee could have been fighting in Virginia. And so, you know, the difference psychologically I've thought about this a lot. You're at Gettysburg and you're there. You know, when the determined defense of Little Round Top on day 2 at Gettysburg, I thought about that a lot. And I thought to myself that, you know, these men, if that was Virginia, they'd have disappeared from. I feel that they would have been more likely not to defend Little Round Top to the extent that they did to the last, you know, because there was someplace to retreat to. When they were defending Little Round Top, they were home. They were in the north. There was no place to really, they couldn't go north they were already in the north. They had to stay, and they did. And they realized at that moment, we can do this, we can win. And like I said, when Grant took over, they still had Meade there, but Grant was the boss. When they had a bloody battle at Spotsylvania, and they turned and moved south to keep going south, they could all see the light in their own way. And I think that has everything to do with Grant's ability to continue on and keep those men fighting. They knew they could see the light at the end of the tunnel at that point. But it was because of Gettysburg that's where their original confidence came from. They didn't have that before Gettysburg. And unfortunately for the Confederacy and for Lee, he made, I think it was, a career mistake. And Shelby Foote may think that it was the stars in their courses. It wasn't the stars. It was Lee's mistake.
Yeah, somehow I got the impression that Lee was just very impatient to want to end the war and thought that Gettysburg was the way to do it.
I feel like I understand Lee's motivation. And I get that from reading his wartime papers. His wartime papers, his correspondence with James Seddon, who was the Confederate War Department head, and with Jeff Davis, was constantly, I'm running out of men. I need more men. And he was also, by 1863, a full year after the Conscription Act, like I mentioned, the hills of northwestern North Carolina and West Tennessee and East Tennessee, where the Unions were, they were filling up with Lee's army. And those men from Appalachia, who they couldn't seem to recruit, who seemed to refuse to fight, and 40,000 or several 100,000 fought for the Union side from Appalachia, from all the different Confederate states. That was telling, and was telling on him. So I feel that Lee felt that if he didn't use his army, he would lose it. And I think that that's a fair assessment of why he did this anyway, despite losing Jackson and having to go through what I think for any general in charge of the whole army is a really meaningful change in command, going from 2 corps to 3 corps, and then switching and creating new organizations right before a huge, decisive campaign like this. That was a desperate situation. But I think he knew that if he didn't fight these battles and try to win a decisive battle in the North, that eventually his army would dissipate away. And I also read enough about what he did and the lengths with which he sought successfully to not allow to have a dragnet behind the army to keep many more men from abandoning, from deserting and heading for the hills. I think that that kind of evidence that I've seen from his own papers, his own wartime papers, is enough to give me that strong feeling that that's why he did it. So doesn't mean I agree with it, but it means that if I agree with it, it doesn't matter. But I certainly feel that's why he did it. He was no fool by any means, but he was, I think by 1863, he was getting pretty desperate. Because he could see that there just weren't that many men, and they weren't coming, they weren't volunteering. I think I mentioned that book, I'll add it to that list, but it's conflict and conscription and conflict in the Confederacy. Not a big book, but it goes into, it's written by the son of the wartime governor of Alabama, who knew a lot of the troops. Eventually, this guy became the president of the University of Alabama. Albert Burton Wood was the author. And he basically goes into the amazing lengths that these guys went to avoid conscription, that they took conscription as an insult. Even the guys in the army took conscription as an insult. That they felt like they had volunteered, and they were volunteers, and now they were just conscripts. And that's one of the things that he understood from, and one of the reasons why he could see more and more desertion. Those one-year veterans who comprised 2/3 of the original Confederate armies, they meant to serve. They volunteered willingly, happily, for 1 year. And they knew that many of their brothers and cousins and friends from hometown didn't volunteer fast enough and couldn't be armed and equipped to go right into battle. So they kept those men at home in militia units for the first year of the war. And then when it came time for these one-year enlistments to run out, those other guys weren't coming forth, and they weren't volunteering. And there were minimal new volunteers. Yes.
This sounds a lot like what Putin is encountering in Ukraine.
Well, I think you're right. But the fact is that when it came time for these men to come forward, they could see that it wasn't going to be a quick, happy little 3-month march into Washington, D.C., which is what they had all thought. And they thought that on both sides, I'm sure. But the point is that in the South, they would have run out of men much more quickly. And in the North, they did a draft a full year later in 1863. But the fact is that, in the South, this conscription thing created all kinds of opportunities for people who have had some money to get doctor's notices that they couldn't serve, bone spurs and things like, it still happens today, when there was a draft. People have, jobs, where they make munitions, and they have important jobs that they produce what the government needs, to fight the war. So they did that too, but, they would become druggists. Apothecaries was the word that they used back in the day. And so a lot of people who didn't want to fight would get several bottles of something and put it in a jar and show that they were apothecaries, that they were running a drugstore on their farm. So it's amazing. The book it tells you just how desperately people did not want to serve the Confederate armies after 1862, and how eventually they kept tightening the noose until they pretty much dragged most able-bodied men by 1864 into the army, and how quickly they just deserted as luck would allow, jumping off a train or do something like that, just to get away, because they knew the cause was lost by mid to late 1864. So I hope that answers your question. Oh my God. Okay, any other questions? I hope we were able to tie this together. To me, the lost cause has everything to do with how Maryland has looked upon its own history. However, it's, the tendency is to try to look at the positives. And if you serve the Confederacy in you were serving, you were in a slave state that you felt was trapped into not succeeding, that you were doing the right thing. I mean, that's essentially what they did. On the other hand, if you did that, if you were in Virginia and you fought for the North, you were never to be forgiven. But that's neither here nor there. That's the history. That's what was happening. So I hope we got, with you all. I appreciate you folks at home on Zoom for participating. Rick, thank you so much for your correspondence. I just thank you all for being here. I mean, it's been a great experience for me to do this. And again, I'm gonna apply to do a lost cause next term.
Great.
So if we can do that, we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.